Hello, BookTube. It's Wednesday, and that's New Comic Book Day here in the United States, when man-breathing boy blobs put away their commemorative Babylon 5 DVD sets and waddle to their LCS, their local comic shop, where they add a bunch of titles to their pull list and buy nothing whatsoever. And once upon a time, for years, I did that. I went to my local comic shop, often had a pull list if I was in the country for long enough, and eagerly soaked up the latest issues. All sorts of things, depending on who was doing what. I followed artists, not writers. So depending on who was doing what and where, this was decades ago when an artist and writer team on a comic book would stay there for a long time. They wouldn't just be there for 6 issues or 5 issues. They'd be there for years. And there was no alternative. For most of those years, there was no alternative. There were comic books, and that was it. There was nobody had an idea that there would be systematic book-style reprints, and that maybe you wouldn't have to get there every week and buy the latest issues. You could just wait for a book. Now that is the norm. Now almost all superhero comics from DC and Marvel Comics, the two foremost superhero publishing houses, eventually come out in a collected volume of one kind or another. That's true for not only the new releases, all of which are now paced for the graphic novel trade market, but also for all the old stuff. There's an incredibly healthy market of old reprints, and that is usually what I get at my own LCS on Wednesdays. If I go, if it's not 100 degrees, if it's not pelting rain, if I'm not perfectly comfortable. There was one Wednesday this summer where I was on the couch, I was reading. My little puppy was on the top of the couch looking out the window. Fragrant summer breezes were coming through the screen window, and I think you would have had to been crazy to put all that aside and go onto the subway and go out and get comic books, interrupt all of that to go out and get comic books. But I had to go out today. I don't know that I would have made this a solitary errand on its own anymore, because the nice thing about books is that they'll be around, so you don't have to grab them. They're not going to be gone. And today was something best avoided. If you know better, if I had any sense in my head, I would check ahead of time. If you remember from reading Dante's Inferno, when Dante gets all the way to the bitterest center of hell, the bitter peak, the bitter pinnacle of all of hell's torments, he encounters a lake of ice, and frozen in the lake of ice up to his waist is the devil himself, Satan, chewing, gnawing the flesh off the backs of traitors for all eternity. And if you'll recall from that climactic moment in the Inferno, Dante looks up at the towering form of Satan and says, "So this is the pinnacle of hell, the worst that the divine punishment gets." At which point, in Dante's telling, Satan spits out one of the traitors and says, "No, you want the absolute worst. It's one layer down." And Dante says, You don't mean, you're not saying," and Satan says, "Yep, Boston public transportation when the Red Sox are in town." I couldn't take that. I'm here instead. And Dante went, "No!" Yeah. That would have been best avoided had I thought about it, but nevertheless, I was committed. I had to go out anyway. So I went to my LCS, and sure enough, there was a reprint that I wanted. No relief from the latest issues this time around, because I had to buy a comic book for the 5th week of Pentathon, of the Paperback Junkies' easiest flippin' readathon you'll ever do. The 5th week of Pentathon is to buy a comic book, is to talk about a comic book. And I decided in my perverse masochism that he did not mean a collection, that he meant a single issue, which meant going to a comic shop. So I had to go anyway, and I bought a latest issue, which I will talk about on Saturday. But I also found a collection. Oh, I found a wonderful collection. It's this. It's the latest epic collection of the mighty Thor. These are full-color paperback reprint series that Marvel is doing according to some arcane numbering system that I don't think anybody really understands. But one more, so it doesn't seem systematic. It jumps all around. For instance, there have been Thor Epic Collection volumes before this one that reprint much later storylines than this. But this was a must-buy. The issues that are collected here are from 1970 and 1971, and they include some low points. The first issues in this collection are the ones in which Jack Kirby and, to a lesser extent, Stan Lee left the title, after having made Thor some incredible cosmic adventures. Some of the issues of the Lee Kirby Thor are as good as Marvel Comics ever got, and the high point of Thor outside of Walt Simonson. But towards the end, Kirby, his heart wasn't in the artwork, and there was only so much that his inker Vince Colletta could do. And also, Stan Lee was stretched a little thin and was starting to pay attention elsewhere. Fortunately, writers like Jerry Conway were right there at his elbow, and fortunately for Jack Kirby, and also later for John Buscema, when he came on the book and was perhaps not quite comfortable with the book designs, with the character designs yet. Fortunately, in addition to Jerry Conway being right there for Stan Lee, John Romita Sr., who was forever and ever the unofficial and then official art director of Marvel Comics, was right there looking at the pages of artists, so that in Thor or the Hulk or whatever, the Avengers, or wherever it is, you'll be reading along, savoring someone's art style, and all of a sudden you'll see a panel that is clearly drawn by John Romita Sr., and you wonder what the original must have looked like that he needed to step in. But so the first few issues of this volume of 1970 are kind of like that. There are missed opportunities here. There's, for instance, Sutor, the Flame Demon, who is the great villain of the Walt Simonson run, and who was also the villain of Thor Ragnarok, the latest movie, visually done wonderfully, appears at the beginning here and is sort of anticlimactic. Kirby messes up his his visual design in a few different panels, and none of it is paced right, and that's followed by a weird story in which Loki swaps faces with Thor, so that it's rather strange. Their faces and their personalities swap bodies, and the story goes on way too long, and appears to be freighted to be much more interesting than it really is, which leads me to believe that it was entirely written by Jerry Conway, because Stan Lee, for all his faults, even when he was phoning in a story, he always knew perfectly well what was interesting and what wasn't. It was, I think, one of his geniuses, and he would never have told a story like that, much less told one that went on so long. But right after that, well, no, not right after that. Right after that is John Buscema joining the book in a weird two-part story where Doctor Doom, the legendary enemy of the Fantastic Four. Those of you who might not know, Doctor Doom was a college student with Reed Richards, the leader of the Fantastic Four, and had a scheme to create what is it, Bean? What is it? I'm talking about comic books. Hello. Oh, I swear this is the nicest dog. None of you are paying attention to me now. What was I saying? Oh, yes. There's an explosion in Dr. Doom's laboratory. Reed Richards tries to warn him that his calculations are off. He arrogantly ignores him. There's an explosion, and Dr. Doom is maimed. His face is maimed. And that makes him insane, of course. In Stan Lee's world, that makes you insane. So he becomes a supervillain. And in this weird two-parter that starts off this volume, he thinks that Dr. Donald Blake, the mortal secret identity of Thor, might have a secret to plastic surgery that would allow him to have a human face again. He kidnaps Dr. Donald Blake and brings him to the kingdom of Latveria, where Doom is absolute monarch. But when he shows Dr. Donald Blake his face, Dr. Blake says, "No, there's nothing medical science can do." That wouldn't be true today. It shouldn't matter anyway. But one way or another, Doom is furious, and a fight ensues, and there's many hijinks, because this was still a time when if Thor let go of his hammer for more than a minute, he compulsively turned back into Dr. Donald Blake. It was a good... Hello. It was a good little signature gimmick weakness, because... none of you are paying any attention to me on my comic book rant. Hi, baby. Hello. We had such a good morning, didn't we? Yes, we did. Stan Lee realized that if he didn't give the God of Thunder a weakness, there'd be no plots. There'd be no gimmick. He'd never lose. Once all that is over, once Thor's regained his hammer and he is confronting Doctor Doom directly, he destroys Doctor Doom's dangerous missile collection, the collection of missiles with which Doctor Doom was going to threaten the rest of the world. and then disdains to fight Doom. It's a wonderful moment in a way. I don't think the writer, Jerry Conway or Stan Lee, really understood it. But there's a great panel where Thor is just flying over Dr. Doom. Dr. Doom is waving his fist in the air and saying, "You and I still have business to settle." And Thor says, "You no longer interest me," and just flies off. But after that comes the heart of this volume. The reason that I snatched it up right away is the Infinity Saga, where Odin, Thor's father, has been warning him for several issues about the world beyond. And when Thor is done with Dr. Doom, he goes to Asgard and learns about the world beyond, and we see distant galaxies and a black hand swallowing them whole. And they're all of their millions of inhabitants being dead-eyed and ensorcelled once that happens. So they're not destroyed. They're turned in some way. And Odin wants to know what's going on. They run through a list of subjects that people who could be even remotely powerful enough, there's nobody. And Odin wants to investigate. He tells Thor, "You will mine the kingdom while I go to investigate the world beyond." And he does. And later on, these issues were from 1971. I could not read them fast enough. My individual issues are all but falling to powder. I love this series so much, this storyline so much. A vision appears in Asgard of a ghostly Odin fighting the master of the world beyond, a being called Infinity, and apparently losing. And Thor decides right then, well, Odin's instructions notwithstanding, I must voyage to the world beyond in order to save my father. So he does, and he encounters a number of beings there. He encounters a number of servants of Infinity, including one who has 4 arms. As they fight in the misty realms of the world beyond, and Thor says, "Thou seekest to crush the son of Odin with yon handheld boulder. But as thou art strong, so Thor is strong. As thou canst fight, so Thor canst fight. But as thou art mortal, Thor be god of thunder." That's when you know that Stan Lee is in the house. And when the dire moment comes, and when we realize who Infinity is and who it is that Odin is actually fighting, it's done wonderfully. It's done just absolutely wonderfully. And Odin eventually prevails. I won't give away the storyline because some of you will want to read it and have it. But I will link down below, just spoilers beware. I did an epic write-up of this for my literary blog years ago. I couldn't resist. So panel by panel, page by page breakdown is down below. But when our heroes return to Asgard and everything seems okay, Odin reminds Thor that while he was in the world beyond, he encountered Hela, the goddess of death, who is also in Thor Ragnarok. A very different version of Hela is in Thor Ragnarok. She's the goddess of death in these comic books. And when Thor encounters her in the world beyond, she tries to claim his life, and another one of those servants of Infinity saves him. And when our heroes get back to Asgard, Odin makes the obvious point, which is that you can only put off Hela so long. You thwarted her desire once, but she will come for you now. And there's nothing to stop her. She's the goddess of death. If she wants you dead, you die. And Thor is horrified, and so are his companions. But there's no fighting Hela in this. In this continuity, she's not the weird creature in Thor Ragnarok who can just call forth an endless supply of daggers, some as big as buildings. I don't even know what that was. But one way or another, Odin warns Thor that if he changes into Dr. Donald Blake and hides on Earth, then Hela won't be able to find him. So he does. But it isn't enough. Hela is certain that Thor is hiding from her, and she doesn't really understand that. There's another wonderful moment, a wonderful Stan Lee moment, where Hela is contemplating what people think of her. She's contemplating her own existence. She's talking to an agent crone, a servant of hers, and she says, "Soon all shall pass through the mists of death, but one thing ever baffles me. Why do the living so fear my touch? Do I not bring peace to those who've borne life's burden? Do I not bring rest at the end of life's weary journey? Do I not banish pain from all who may suffer? Do I not cure all ills and put an end to all wounds? Why then do men hate me and fear my approach? In truth I am gentle. In truth I am fair. To me all are equal. I deny none my embrace. She doesn't understand why she is so reviled. We see her in a great John Buscema panel. We see her taking the life of an aged person in a hospital, saving a soldier from further suffering. She doesn't get it. She doesn't get it at all. And soon enough, she tricks Thor into appearing and claims him. And the last-ditch effort of his friends up in Asgard is to invoke Odin, to get his father to intervene, even though Odin knows he can't possibly do that. You cannot interfere with death. But at the last minute, he does. He strikes Hela down. But Thor, in an utmost moment of nobility, reminds him that you've killed death. You can't have a universe without death. This is the natural order that you're tampering with. You can't do that. You have to revive her, even though it means my own death. And Odin does, but the last thing he does before, when Thor is withering, Hela has begun to age him into death. He's laying down on the ground, he's helpless, he's beaten, and Odin is grieving. He does one last thing. He summons the Lady Sif, who was not in Thor Ragnarok. I keep going back to Thor Ragnarok, but she was in the previous 2 Thor movies. And she's a warrior goddess. Even in the 1970s, she was still a warrior goddess. There are wonderful moments in here. She fights right alongside the men. She did that during the Lee Kirby years to wonderful effect. And she does that during the Walt Simonson run as well. And she confronts Hela, the goddess of death, who towers over her. Hela is like 8 feet tall. Sif confronts her and says, Hela, though thou be the queen of death, thou art a woman too. Surely love hath touched thine heart? And Hela says, why speakest thou to me of love? And Sif says, 'tis all I know, 'tis all there be. Without it life hath no meaning and no joy. Thou couldst still save the dying Thor. Thou must, O Hela. The regal Odin may not beg, for he be lord of Asgard. And I am a woman, as thou art a woman. I beg, I plead, Sif doth implore thee. Or, if my words should move thee not, this last request I make thee. Do but spare the mighty Thor, and take Sif's life in forfeit. And Hela says, thou wouldst die to save thy true beloved? Sif asked Hela if Hela had ever known love, and now I know and now I answer nay. But at least I know what it doth mean, and not even death may crush it. And she's crying. And she brings Thor back to life. And they return to Asgard, but there's trouble yet again with Loki this time around. And the story just shifts into another high gear adventure, guest starring the Silver Surfer and some wonderful, wonderful stuff where a doubt of mine during the highlight of the Lee Kirby years. Jack Kirby had an inker called Vince Colletta who did an incredible job. And John Buscema is a completely different artist from Jack Kirby. He is much more sinuous, much more classically trained. Not quite so good with the action scenes, just because in terms of action sequences, I don't think anybody was as good as Kirby. But I remember when Buscema came on the book, I was thinking, well, okay, Kirby's heart clearly isn't in it. I would hate to see him go, but his heart's not in it anymore, so better to get a really, really good artist. But I wondered even at the time what Vince Colletta's inking would look like on John Buscema, and Colletta was a total professional. But I thought, you're so accustomed to this artist, how will you adapt to a completely different artist? I need not have worried. The Vince Colletta inks on John Buscema's pencils at the end of this are incredible. And the next storyline, the one that follows right from the issues in this book, God knows when the Epic Collection will hop around to it, is the highlight of their team up. But the reason I got this was the Infinity Saga. And it got me thinking when I was lovingly reading through this, because my issues really deserve to be retired. They really do. I have been reading them nonstop since 1971, and that's a large burden to put on something that was made for 15 cents and designed to last a month. But what I was thinking of was Deus Ex Machina. Those of you who are lit students will have heard that phrase. It comes from the ancient Greeks, and it means a god out of a machine, god out of nowhere. And it's a classic device of Greek theater and also of Roman theater and then of fiction. and melodrama of any kind, including TV, where the plot, the strands of the plot are moving towards conclusions, and the conclusions just can't, the writer can't make them come out right unless a brute force comes in from above and just fixes things, just flat out fixes things. Now, the Greeks tended to use Deus Ex Machina, a point that not a lot of people who read the few Greek plays that we have left, not a lot of people who read them see it, but the Greeks often use Deus Ex Machina for comedic effect. One person who got that was Shakespeare, because if you have just somebody, a god, just come in out of the blue and fix everything, that is kind of funny. The other thing, though, that Deus Ex Machina is disappointing, right? If you're watching a plot and you're invested in these characters, you don't want the writer to throw up his hands at the end and say, I can't figure out how to make it come out right. Let's just do this. I'll just have a god come on and fix everything. That's the same kind of cop-out as it was all a dream. That makes people howl in outrage because it's a betrayal of the storyteller's art. And that was always a problem with the Marvel Comics Thor. He's the Prince of Asgard. He's incredibly strong. He has an enchanted hammer. He has a great rogues gallery of villains, both on Earth and when he has otherworldly adventures. Stan Lee liked to mix them up. He would give you an earthly adventure of Thor, and then he would put him off somewhere like the world beyond or some epic fight in Asgard, and then change it up again. But the problem with Thor is that in these comic books, he's the Prince of Asgard, and his half-brother Loki is also a Prince of Asgard, but he's evil. That's great. That sets up a good-evil dichotomy. But looming above it all is Odin himself, who is the ultimate Deus Ex Machina, right? I mean, he's Thor's father. So, and he never ceases to tell us, he knows all, he sees all, he is the way, the word, and the wonder. So you don't slip anything past Odin, although he's forever saying that, and yet he's forever being surprised in all of these storylines. But still, if you know that, then, you know, if Thor is fighting the Wrecking Crew back on Earth, and he's having a really tough time of it, you know that if Odin is alive and awake, and not in the Odin sleep, and not otherwise preoccupied or angry with his son, he can save him. He's the ultimate Deus Ex Machina. One of the geniuses of the Infinity storyline was to turn that on its head, was to put the Deus Ex Machina in jeopardy. And then what happens? Now that was wonderful. That is wonderfully done. I still think the ending of the Infinity Saga is a wee bit of a cop-out, but still, it was glorious. I loved it when I was reading it. And it came out in a Marvel Masterworks. Marvel also, in addition to the Epic Collection, they do hardcover volumes of Marvel Masterwork reprints, also in color. And I believe I have that volume with the Infinity Saga, but I had to get this too. Because this doesn't just have that. This has the issues, 5 or 6 issues on either side of it that are like those Doctor Doom issues, or the issues with the Silver Surfer after the Infinity Saga that are also fun. I also have those individual issues, and they also deserve to be retired. So that's my comic book rant for today. Believe it or not, after all this time, I'm still talking about the Infinity Saga. I won't say that it's a great Thor saga. I'm not 100% sure that really works. It's a grand Stan Lee saga of Thor, but the high watermark for Thor sagas is so high. For instance, there's an Epic Collection of one of the greatest. It was done by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and the volume that in the Epic Collection is To Wake the Mangog. I've also done an epic panel-by-panel, page-by-page, issue-by-issue breakdown of that. I'll include a link down below. I've written about Thor a lot. But the interesting thing for me is that if you want to talk about epic storylines, the Infinity Saga is a little bit too manic and a little bit too tail-chasing to really merit it, although the John Buscema artwork is amazing. Right after these storylines, there is a different storyline. Still Jerry Conway, still John Buscema with Vince Coletta inking, but something much closer to claiming epic status. And if the Epic Collection ever gets to it, I'll be sure to bore you with it. But that... Thor would have to wait a while. These are grand issues. Thor would have to wait a little while for another truly epic span. I don't know if the Epic Collection will actually do that. We'll see. But Thor fans will already know what I'm talking about. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I just wanted to give you a little Thor breakdown on the Infinity Saga and the Deus Ex Machina gimmick for our Comic Book Wednesday. But this is not the only time this week that I will talk about comic books, because today, in addition to this glorious thing in full color, I also bought an individual comic book for my sins for Pentathon. And I will be talking about that comic book on Saturday. So you can tune back in then. But until then, I will wrap this up and we'll go back to talking about books. Thank you, BookTube.